Welcome to the University of Charleston. It's a pleasure to see you here. Spring is breaking out, so I think that's a good thing and should add to the mood. I'm Dr. Ed Welch, and I happen to be the president of this university, and it's a pleasure to be in that situation. We have an interesting evening ahead, and I'm looking forward to the presentation that we will hear. It's an exciting time on campus. We're looking forward to graduation in about 3 weeks or so. We'll graduate some 340 students. We continue to have the highest full-time enrollment that we've had in the history of the institution. And if you're interested, our graduation speaker will be Jeanette Walls, whom some of you know wrote The Glass Castle and had her early years in West Virginia in pretty trying circumstances and has achieved and grown wonderfully well. I'd encourage you to turn off those things that make noise if you would be cooperative so you don't interfere with my listening. I'll be selfish about it, or those other people who are sitting next to you. The program is funded by the Sims Foundation. We are extraordinarily grateful for their interest in the university and interest in our having ongoing programs under a theme of In God We Trust. And I see Herc Sims did make it to town. So Herc, we thank you and your family for your support of what we're doing here. So appreciate it. We do take questions that are written. So some of you have pads of paper and pencils. If you wish to write questions anytime during the presentation or thereafter, please do so. Pass them to the aisles and students will pick them up. The students who have hosted you tonight, and you will see walking around, are all presidential scholars. That means they are very, very smart and talented, and we're glad to have them here and glad to have them participating tonight. The topic is one that is of interest to many, many people and probably to society as a whole. What is happening in our country as a result of changes in religious belief and practice and religious affiliation as well. Dr. Jessica Hamar Martinez is a research associate at the Pew Research Center. She contributes to their polling on religion in the United States, emphasizing religion and the Latino community. Before joining the Pew Research Center, she worked as a project manager at the Center for the Study of Latino Religion and the Center for the Study of Religion and Society, both at a small place called the University of Notre Dame. I think they have basketball teams, if I remember correctly, and lots of other things. But she received both a doctorate and a master's degree in sociology from the University of Arizona. It's great that she bounced across the way from Washington, D.C. on a nice little airplane in a windy day to come to us. Please welcome Dr. Martinez.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction. I'm just going to take 1 second to put this other microphone on, just in case I move around a little bit. Give me 1 second. How's that? Can you hear me from that one? Yeah? Okay, great. Yeah? Can you hear it? Oh, it's upside down now. How about now? Okay. All right. Well, thanks so much for inviting me here today. I'm really excited for this opportunity to be able to share with you some of the work that we do at the Pew Research Center. So in my presentation tonight, I'll give you a sense of the religious landscape of the United States, what it looks like, and how it's been changing recently. And as I'm sure many of you are already aware, one of the ways that the religious landscape has been changing is that Americans are becoming less likely to report that they're affiliated with any religion. So that'll really be the main focus of my... How about if I talk more into this one? Can you hear that okay? Okay. I'll keep the volume up a little bit more. All right, so I'll just repeat a little bit of that if you weren't able to hear. So I'm going to show you what the religious landscape looks like in the U.S. and how it's been changing a little bit in recent years. And one of the main ways that it's been changing is that people are becoming less likely to report that they're affiliated with any particular religion. And so that'll be the main focus of what I show you in my slides tonight is the increasing share of the country that's religiously unaffiliated, who are also often referred to as the nuns, the N-O-N-E-S, so not to be confused with N-U-N-S. So if I'm talking about nuns tonight, it's the unaffiliated. So we'll talk a little bit about what this trend looks like, what are some things that might be contributing to it or behind it, and who are the nuns? Who is this group of people that no longer affiliates with religion in the United States? First, I'll give you just a little bit of background information about the Pew Research Center. So we're an independent, nonpartisan fact tank, we like to call ourselves. We're nonpartisan and non-advocacy, and we are a nonprofit organization. We have a strict non-advocacy stance, so we don't take positions on political or policy issues or on religious issues or any other kinds of matters. We see ourselves more as observers who are providing information to the public. So we don't take any clients or conduct polling on behalf of other organizations. So we don't do commercial or marketing research. We do social science research. And we were established by the Pew Charitable Trust as an independent research organization with the mission of providing trustworthy, objective information that policymakers and journalists and scholars and other interested members of the public can use to understand the important issues of the day. And so at the Pew Research Center, we do research on many different topics, from politics to social trends to demographics, global attitudes, various topics that we study. Our research on religion and public life in particular is aimed towards reaching a deeper understanding of the issues at the intersection of religion and public affairs. So most of my work at the center involves public opinion polling or survey research that has to do with religion in the United States. So that's what I'm focusing on today. So this first slide, I have a feeling some of the labels are kind of small, but I'll explain to you what this shows. This shows religious affiliation of U.S. adults, and this is based on aggregated surveys conducted by the Pew Research Center in 2012. So I'm going to try this other microphone. Can you hear me okay if I do that? So if you look at this pie chart, what it shows you is about half of the U.S. public falls into the category of Protestant. And we break that further into subgroups of Protestants for most of our analyses, which includes white evangelical Protestants, which about 1 in 5 Americans are white evangelical Protestants. About 15% are white mainline Protestants. 8% are black Protestants, and then there's a small share that doesn't fall into any of these three categories. About 1 in 5 Americans is now Catholic. And so you can see that if you were to combine those Protestant and Catholic and then a couple more slices over there, the Orthodox, the Mormons, a majority of Americans still identify as Christian. So you could really slice this pie in many different ways to make it look less diverse, but also you could slice it to make it more diverse if you were looking at all the different denominations, for example, that are made up of Protestants. So these are sort of some of our main categories for analysis. And then you can see some of the smaller shares over there made up of Jews and Muslims, Buddhists and Hindus, some smaller groups in the US, but large world religions nonetheless. And then that last slice over there, the biggest one sort of on the left and the top, that's the religiously unaffiliated. So these are people who tell us when we ask them in a survey, you know, what's your religion? We give them a list of several options. These are people who tell us that they're either atheist or agnostic or just nothing in particular. These are the people that we refer to as the unaffiliated. And you can see that 1 in 5 say they're unaffiliated. And this share has grown in recent years, while the share who are Protestant has been on the decline. So if we look at the long-term trend, these two changes become more apparent. So this slide shows you data from the General Social Survey, often referred to as the GSS, which are surveys that have been conducted every couple of years or so since the early 70s. And over that time, the Protestant share, which is the red line at the top, has declined from a fairly steady 6 in 10 or so US adults identifying as Protestants in the 70s and 80s. This pointer doesn't really work. There we go. To about half in the most recent survey conducted by the GSS. And over the same period, the share of US adults saying they have no religion has grown from 1 in 20, that's the bottom line there, 1 in 20 in the early 70s to 1 in 5 now. So this is a pretty significant change. The Catholic share of the population, which is the middle line there, has been relatively stable over this time period. Maybe a little bit of change, but anywhere from a fifth to a quarter of Americans identifying as Catholic. And this share of the US population has at least partially been bolstered by immigration from predominantly Catholic countries like Mexico. So these changes in the landscape are also apparent if we look just at the short term, if we sort of zoom in on the last few years or so. And this is particularly interesting because while this 5-point change among Protestants from 53% to 48%, it seems like it's not that large of a change, but when it comes to measures of identity like religion, you don't really see changes of this magnitude over such a relatively short period of time very often. So in Pew Research surveys conducted as recently as 2007, we were still finding that a majority of Americans describe themselves as Protestants, but more recently, that figure has started to dip under the halfway point. And just as we've seen the Protestant share decline, we've seen the unaffiliated share, or the religious nones, in our surveys grow. So in our surveys as recently as 2007, about 15% of US adults were unaffiliated, and more recently we find that as many as 1 in 5 say they're unaffiliated. One other important thing to note from this chart, notice the composition of the nones. So you often hear about the nones described as non-believers or as seculars. You might often hear that term. And that's not really an accurate way to describe this group. Only a minority of the nones, so these bottom two slices of this particular chart, describe themselves as either atheists or agnostics. The remainder, which is a majority of the nones, describe their religion as just nothing in particular. So they're not necessarily non-believers. They're not necessarily a-religious or even anti-religion in their outlook. They're just not personally identified with any particular religious group. So I'll say more about this as we move ahead. Okay, that's better? All right, I'll lean in. Okay, so this next chart just shows you among some subgroups of US adults, the share that identified as unaffiliated in our 2007 surveys and the share in our 2012 surveys. And so the last column shows you the net change over time. And what you see from this is that the growth in the share of American nones is demographically pretty broad-based. So we've seen both men and women have become less religiously affiliated in recent years. College graduates, as well as those with less than a college education, have become more unaffiliated. We've seen an uptick in disaffiliation from religion among the rich and the poor, and in all regions of the country as well. So there's not one single group we can point to and say, this is where the change is occurring. Rather, it's a very broad-based trend. So what then is behind these trends, and what can we point to help us understand what's going on if it's not one particular group that we're looking at? There's a lot to consider here, and there are likely multiple factors at play, but a few of the factors that we can analyze with our data include generational replacement, the possibility that secularization might be underway in the US to some degree, and the impact of religious switching. So let's focus first on generational replacement. So this chart here shows you the share who are unaffiliated or who are affiliated with religion by age categories. So the top bar is those who are 18 to 29. You can see that among young adults, they're quite a bit less affiliated and more unaffiliated than older folks. So among those 18 to 29, about 3 in 10 are unaffiliated, compared with those 65 and over who only 10% say they're unaffiliated. So it's a fairly stark contrast. So this begs the question, is this an age-related or a life cycle phenomenon, or is it a cohort-related phenomenon? In other words, might these young people become more affiliated as they get older? That is, as they move through the life cycle, as they get married, settle down, have kids, don't they become more religious? Are you getting feedback from the microphone, or is it okay now? Okay. It's still not loud enough? Is this better? You can't hear that one at all, right? I'll just have to talk louder. Is that better? Okay. So I was starting to ask then, is this an age thing? Is it that younger people will become more affiliated as they get older? There's sort of a perception that as people have families, as they have children, they come back into the fold, they become more religious over time. But as it turns out, the answer to that is fairly complicated. It depends on the measures that you're looking at. So there are some ways in which people do tend to become more religious as they get older, and prayer is a good example of this. So as people get older, they report praying more frequently. And this chart looks at different generational cohorts over time and how many people within each cohort say they pray every day. So the top line, that red line, shows the greatest generation, those people born before 1928. The second line down, the yellow one, shows the silent generation, those born in the 1930s and the early 1940s. And what I want to zoom in on is the third line. So this grayish, brownish sort of line, that's the baby boomer generation. And back in the early 1980s, when baby boomers were in their 20s and 30s, about half of them indicated that they pray every day. And as time went by, so you can see as this middle gray line goes from left to right, they indicated that they prayed more often as time went by. Today, now that baby boomers are sort of reaching retirement age, nearly 2/3 tell us that they pray every day. And we see a similar pattern among Generation X, which is the blue line down there. So in the late 90s, when Gen X was just reaching adulthood, about 4 in 10 reported praying daily. And now that they're in their 30s and 40s, nearly 6 in 10 Gen Xers say that they pray every day. So it's hard to know exactly why people become more prayerful as they get older. It could be that they're becoming more prayerful as they begin to face their own mortality. It could be in response to health challenges, other sorts of life challenges. It could be any number of things, really. But whatever the reason, it's pretty clear that people do become more prayerful as they age. So in that sense, people are becoming more religious in a way as they get older. But it's not the case that people become more likely to be religiously affiliated as they get older. So this is the same kind of chart. It shows you the same generational cohorts, but this examines the percent of people who say they're religious nuns, the unaffiliated, and how that has changed over time. And what jumps out immediately about this chart is how flat the lines tend to be, so how little change there really is. So if we focus again on the baby boomers, it's the middle line there. Back in the late 70s, when baby boomers were just entering adulthood, 13% said they were religious nuns. Now, if people become more affiliated as they get older, we'd expect this line showing the disaffiliated to go down over time, but that's not what we see. Among baby boomers, the line's pretty flat, and in recent years, 15% describe themselves as unaffiliated. And so that's virtually identical to what we saw in the late 70s. And you see the same thing among these other cohort lines, very little change over time in the share saying that they're unaffiliated. So they're not more likely to claim a religion as they get older. So part of what's going on here then is generational replacement. The younger adults are much less affiliated than their parents and their grandparents currently are, but they're also much less affiliated than these previous generations were when they were that same age. So there's no reason to think, assuming that past is precedent, that they'll become religiously affiliated in large numbers as they get older. And so people do become more religious in some ways as they age through the life cycle, but they don't become more religiously affiliated. So generational replacement is really part of what's going on. As younger generations replace older generations, the overall religious landscape is changing. It's shifting towards less affiliation overall. Another obvious question that arises when we're discussing the rise of the nuns relates to secularization. Is the growth in the size of the nuns some kind of indicator that the US is becoming less religious? There are some indicators that the US might be becoming less religious. So for example, the share who say they seldom or never attend religious services has ticked up slightly but noticeably over the last decade. So this shows you the share of people saying they attend religious services weekly or more, monthly or yearly, and seldom or never, and over time how that's changed. And you can see that while the high attenders, the weekly or more, and even the moderate attenders, monthly or yearly, those haven't changed much over time. That bottom line, those who saying they seldom or never attend, has just started to tick up a little bit. And we've also seen a long-term decline in the percent saying that they never doubt the existence of God. So back in the late 1980s, nearly 9 in 10 Americans agreed with this statement, saying they never doubt the existence of God. In recent years, we've seen this number begin to come down. So in 2012, we find about 8 in 10 compared to 9 in 10, saying they have no doubt about God's existence. So there's some evidence that the US is becoming a little bit less religious in certain ways. However, there are several other measures on which religious commitment looks quite stable. For example, the number saying religion is very important to them hasn't changed much in recent years. And there's been no change in recent decades in the percent saying that prayer is an important part of their daily life. 76% of people said this in 2012, 76% said it in 1987, so no change over that long time period. And relatively speaking, the US remains a highly religious country, especially by comparison with other advanced industrial democracies. So while this growth of the so-called nuns could reflect some degree of secularization, it could also just be that people are starting to change the way that they describe themselves religiously to better match their level of religious observance. And so my next slide sort of shows you what I mean by this. So this chart shows you among those who seldom or never attend worship service, how many consider themselves unaffiliated over time, and then among those who attend more often, among those who attend weekly or more, how many of those people consider themselves unaffiliated over time. So if you look at the top line here, it shows you that in 2007, among those who seldom or never attended worship services, 38% identified as religious nuns. And by 2012, this number had increased by 11 percentage points. So you see that top line going up. Half now say that they're nuns. But if you look at the lines for those who attend religious services more frequently, by comparison, they're quite flat. Virtually everyone who says they attend religious worship services weekly or more also says that they're part of one religious group or another. So on one hand, this is obvious. Of course, regular churchgoers are going to identify with a religion. But what this shows is that virtually all of the growth among the nuns has come among those who seldom or never attend religious services. So that's the key point here that I'm trying to make, is that these are people who weren't attending religious services in the first place. So over this time, the percentage of people who seldom or never attend worship services has just changed slightly, but the number of these infrequent attenders describing themselves as religious nuns has changed quite a bit. So in short, part of the reason that the ranks of the unaffiliated have grown in recent years is that Americans who are not particularly religious, at least by this conventional measure, increasingly describe themselves as atheists or agnostics or as nothing in particular. So perhaps they're letting go of an attachment to a childhood religion that they don't really participate in anyway. Perhaps it's become more acceptable to say that you're not part of any particular religion. Regardless of why this is happening, people are becoming more likely to describe themselves in this way without necessarily changing their behavior very much. So there's one last element to this and one important thing to understand about what's driving these trends, and that's religious switching. So you might not be able to see the numbers from there, but what this chart shows you is among the three major groups, Protestants, Catholics, and the unaffiliated, the share who were raised in that religion, the share at the end who are currently in that religion, and in between, the share who either entered or left that religion between childhood and adulthood. So religious switching is something that's very common in the US. Something like a quarter of adults tell us that they're currently something different from what they were raised in. And if we include movement within Protestantism, so Methodist to Baptist or Episcopalian to Pentecostal, that number is as high as 44%. So people change their religion a lot in the US. And the nuns are the biggest gainer in this process of religious switching. So only 7% of American adults in our 2007 Religious Landscape Survey said that they were raised with no religion. And many of those who were raised with no religion have essentially left, have become some religion. But there's a huge number of people who were raised in a religion, mostly Protestantism and Catholicism in the US, who are now nuns. So you can see here that Protestants more or less hold their own with respect to religious switching. So about 54% of folks were raised Protestant, about 51% at this point said they were currently Protestant. So that's not a huge amount of shifting in and out. But among Catholicism, this group loses more people in total to religious switching than any other group. So 31% of Americans in 2007 said they were raised Catholic, 24% were currently Catholic at that point. So there are roughly 4 former Catholics for every convert into Catholicism. So this gives you some idea of what's behind the trend of the growth of the nuns in American religion. Some of it's generational replacement, some of it's just a changing way of describing oneself, and some of it has to do with switching in and out of different groups. But I thought it also might be helpful to give you a more in-depth look at who the nuns themselves are. So who is this group? Why are they nuns? What are the prospects that they'll become affiliated at some point? So going back to the composition of the religious nuns, the first thing to realize about the nuns is that they're not all non-believers. To be sure, they're certainly less religious in many ways compared with the public overall and compared with those who identify with a religious group, but it would be a real mistake to conflate the nuns with non-believers overall. So you can see that here, and I alluded to this a little earlier, you've got about 3 in 10 nuns who identify as atheist or agnostic, but the rest just describe themselves as nothing in particular when we ask them what their religion is. And even though they're unaffiliated with a religion, some nuns do tell us that religion is an important part of their lives. In fact, 14% of nuns, and 1 in 5 of those who describe their religion as nothing in particular, describe themselves as seeing religion as very important in their lives. So you can see the nuns are far less likely than the general public. That top bar is importance of religion among the general public. The next one is the unaffiliated overall. So compared to the general public overall, religion is not particularly important to this group, but nonetheless, there's at least some evidence of some sort of religious or spiritual pulse, so to speak, among the nuns. It's not that everyone who says they have no particular religion has no religious practice or belief behind them. So this slide speaks directly to the question of belief. You can see here that most nuns, again, it's the second bar there, about 2/3 tell us they do believe in God. To be sure, they believe in God at lower rates than the general public. Among the affiliated, 97% of people say they believe in God. And while the unaffiliated believe in God, many of them aren't absolutely convinced about this belief. So the lighter blue is, I believe in God, but I'm not entirely certain about the existence of God. But this still illustrates pretty dramatically, I think, that nuns are not all non-believers. So clearly, though they're less religious than the public as a whole on many measures, they're not just non-believers, they're not wholly secular in their outlook, so it'd be a mistake to conflate them with non-believers. But at the same time, it would also be a mistake to think of the nuns as either seekers or as practitioners of alternative religions. So we've asked over the years about a series of what might be thought of as alternative religious beliefs and practices. And these are some examples here. We asked people about their belief in spiritual energy and physical things like mountains and trees and crystals, about belief in astrology and reincarnation, in yoga as a religious practice. And this shows you the general public figures overall compared with the unaffiliated. And the main takeaway of this slide is there's very little difference between the unaffiliated and the general public overall. So about a quarter of nuns say they believe in astrology or in reincarnation, but they don't hold these beliefs at higher numbers than what we see among the US public as a whole. And a lot of self-identified Christians, so Protestants and Catholics, also hold these beliefs. So they're not something that's just characteristic of the nuns. And many nuns also tell us that belonging to a community of shared believers isn't all that important to them. So this shows you, compared to several other religious groups, those saying that belonging to a community of people who share your beliefs and values is very important, somewhat important, then it gets less important. And you can see the unaffiliated are at the very bottom. Just 28% say it's very important to them to belong to a community of people who share their values and beliefs. So in a sense, they're not really telling us that they feel like they're missing something by virtue of being religiously unaffiliated and not being involved in a religious community. And you see that in this slide as well. We asked those nothing in particulars directly, so not the atheists and agnostics, but those who said they had no particular religion. We asked them, would you say you're looking for a religion that's right for you? And the vast majority tell us they're not doing this. 88% say no, they're not looking for a religion that's right for them. So these people are not really out there seeking, they're not looking for a new spiritual home necessarily, and by and large, they don't feel like they're missing anything by virtue of being religiously unaffiliated. So if the nuns are neither hostile towards religion nor necessarily seeking something new and different, what does drive the nuns to become nuns? I think there are many contributing answers to that complex question, but we can at least point to a few factors from our data. So you probably can't see this slide very well, but this shows some of the reasons that people say are important to them when we ask them why they're no longer part of their religion. And the one that's at the top there, you might not be able to read it, but the number one reason that people give for becoming unaffiliated is that they just gradually drifted away from the religion that they were raised in. So the decision to leave religion is not always precipitated by some event. It's not always something that's a deeply thought out decision. For many people, it's a gradual, organic sort of evolution. They just sort of slide away. But notice as well that many say they stopped believing their religion's teachings. That's the second one there. So even if as a group the unaffiliated are not non-believers, many may not believe particular teachings of their childhood religion. And our survey also suggests that there are things that nuns don't like about religion. They're not wholly anti-religious, and they don't, they do think that there are things that religious organizations do well, like playing an important role in helping the poor and needy, for example, but there are certain things that they don't like about religion. So this shows you the unaffiliated is the dark purple bar, and the affiliated are the light purple bar, and this is their responses to our questions about religious organizations. You can see about 7 in 10 of the unaffiliated think that religious organizations are too concerned with money and power. About 2/3 say that religious organizations focus too much on rules, and about as many, 2/3, say that religious organizations are too involved with politics. Some of you might be familiar with the work of scholars like Putnam and Campbell and Houghton Fisher, who have argued that religion has become increasingly associated with right-wing politics in some ways, and those who are not on the political right began to disassociate from religion. This would be somewhat consistent with that argument, as would what we know about the politics of the nuns. So The unaffiliated tends to be a more strongly liberal and democratic group than those who are affiliated. And it's a group that has consistently voted Democratic and holds liberal views on social issues like abortion and marriage equality, for example. And they largely want religion to stay out of politics. So most, for example, don't think it's important for their president to have strong religious beliefs, and most do think that churches should keep out of political matters and that they should refrain from endorsing political candidates. So it may be that there's a religion and politics link here that's associated with, if not behind, the growth of the nuns. So I want to sort of wrap things up here so we have plenty of time to answer questions that you all might have. I hope this has been helpful. If I could sort of sum up and leave you with a few main points, it would be that the growth of the nuns is one of, and perhaps the key trend in American religion in recent years, that there are a number of factors behind this trend, including generational replacement, possibly some secularization, and religious switching, and that we need to be careful about generalizing about the nuns as a whole. They're not simply non-believers, but at the same time, they're not necessarily spiritual seekers, at least not in disproportionate numbers. And for many, they're just not associated with any particular religion, nor do they feel like they're missing anything by virtue of that lack of attachment. So this is also a group that's relatively young compared to the general population as a whole, but there's very little evidence that the nuns will become affiliated as they move through the life cycle. So this is a trend that we'll continue to watch at the Pew Research Center and learn more about as we collect more survey data on religion in America. And I'd encourage those of you who are interested to sign up for our newsletter so you'll be the first to hear as we publish new findings on religion and public life. Thank you so much for your time tonight. I look forward to your questions.
Testing, testing. I can hear me. Okay. I hear me all over. I have a number of questions that I will throw at you. And Dr. Martinez is a sociologist. She will be probably more analytical than she will be judgmental or moralistic. But you are quite free to ask questions to push her analysis. And I would just also underscore one other thing that she said. You know, when you have a population as large as the United States and you're doing population studies, you don't expect to find very much variation over time because the population is so big. And so when you get a switch of 11% of people and how they're responding over some period of 5 years or 7 years, it really is dramatic information. A couple of questions about the data themselves. Do you think more recently people are skeptical about those who call and ask them questions about religion, so you may not get accurate answers?
Can you hear out of this microphone? Yeah? That's a good question. I think we know from declining response rates over time that people are becoming less likely to respond to surveys on the phone, but I don't know to what degree they're becoming more skeptical when it comes to a question about religious affiliation. I would expect that if people didn't want to answer that, they'd be more likely to say they don't know or to refuse to answer the question, because we do have that category that we can show. But I don't know to what degree people would say nothing in particular rather than expressing their religion. It's a valid question, but I don't have an exact answer to it.
Do you make calls on cell phones or landlines, and would that affect the responses you have?
We call on both landlines and cell phones. That's something that we started to do several years ago. When we did our 2007 Religious Landscape Survey, which I mentioned a couple of times in this presentation, it was a survey of 35,000 US adults. At that point, we had still been doing only landline, so we did an experiment where we also called many people on the cell phone to see how that affected our sampling. And what we found at that point was that our weighting was correcting for any difference that we were finding. So it wasn't affecting it at that point. But cell phone use has increased so dramatically since then that we have continued to call more and more cell phones. And in fact, now we call more cell phones than landline phones. So we try to keep up with the changes in the population overall as far as phone use.
When you look at all of those who say nothing in particular, the subset of those who say they're atheist or agnostic is somewhat small. Do you think that there are more people today who are afraid to admit that they're atheist or agnostic and therefore underreporting?
I think there's probably some degree of that. There's still some social desirability in the U.S. when it comes to religion, and there's some negative connotation certainly associated with saying you're an atheist. You know, when we ask people how they feel about different religious groups, we find that Americans are not particularly friendly toward atheists, so there is some sense that it might be difficult to mention that you're an atheist, and it's easier to say you're nothing in particular. But at the same time, we have seen that share saying they're atheist also ticking up along with the nothing in particulars.
Now it's time for a little analysis. To gain power, American Christianity linked itself to one political party. Is this linkage having the opposite effect long-term of bringing a decline in religious participation?
Potentially, and that's one sociological theory. I mentioned Putnam and Campbell and Houghton Fisher are some of the scholars who have suggested that what we're seeing with the growth of the nothing in particulars might be some pushback against this association between right-wing politics and conservative Christianity. But at the same time, when we look at our data, when we look at tens of thousands of surveys over the last several years, we're seeing a growth in the unaffiliated among all demographic groups. So it's not just that liberal mainline Protestants are no longer calling themselves Christians, for example. We're seeing change among different age groups, among men and women, among different political orientations. So there could be something to that, but it's not the whole story.
This will push your religious studies a bit. The eminent 20th century theologian Karl Barth distinguished religion as a human institution from true Christianity. If he might be correct, does the decline of religion open up opportunities for true Christianity?
That's a really big question that I'm not sure that I can answer. I certainly can't address that with our data.
Now you're the sociologist, not the Pew researcher.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it could be that as we monitor this trend, we'll see the development of sort of a different kind of religious identity that maybe our current questions aren't picking up because our questions haven't changed with religious identity. But I think it's something that it would take many years to be able to tease out.
Does the education system in America, in your judgment, have an impact on the religious beliefs of the public?
Well, there's certainly some work, or at least some speculation, that higher education has been associated with decline in religion. Maybe the causal direction has never really been established. Is it that people who are less religiously inclined are more likely to pursue higher education, or is it that you go to college, you're exposed to people of different faiths, of different backgrounds, maybe you start to question your own background? Those are some of the things that people wonder. But again, when we've looked at our figures, the rise in the unaffiliated is occurring among various levels of education. So another sort of answer it could be part of it, but it's definitely not all of it.
If I can cite something you said earlier to me. As you were looking at all of these data, you were suggesting that it might be a reflection of a bigger social phenomenon that's happening in the United States. called apathy. You want to say something about that and how you might interpret the data in a bigger context?
Yeah, so in our conversation earlier, we were kind of talking about this, and I was alluding to maybe some of you have heard of Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, and he was talking about people becoming sort of disaffiliated and disengaged more broadly. So it could be that people's disaffiliation from religion is part of a bigger trend of people just being less civically involved, less likely to connect themselves with institutions. So it could just be that it's part of a much bigger trend of people being sort of less connected to communities overall.
You are a student of Latino behavior and growth and change. How has the rise of number of Latinos in the country impacted religious belief?
It's really interesting, actually, because there are sort of these various demographic factors that are converging to make a really complicated picture. So on the one hand, I mentioned briefly that the fact that the share of the country who is Catholic has remained steady over time in our surveys of the general public is at least in part due to sort of a boosting of the numbers from immigrants from predominantly Catholic places like Mexico. So the Hispanic population in the US has grown tremendously in the last few decades, and this is a population that is predominantly Catholic, so that affects that sort of slice of the pie. But at the same time, we've seen the same trend among Latinos in the US. So in our survey in 2013 that specifically focused on Latinos and religion, we found that while they're still majority Catholic, they're also switching religious affiliation either to Protestantism or to being unaffiliated. So there's a growth in the unaffiliated among this population as well. So the interesting thing is that while there's a declining share of Latinos who are Catholic, there's still an increasing share of Catholics who are Latino. So there could be a point at which a majority of Catholics in the US are Latino, even as a majority of Latinos are no longer Catholic.
Okay. If those of you in the back have some other questions, bring them up, and we can use them. Or you've got them over here. Thank you very much. You know, you talk about the changing dynamic within Protestantism and people moving from one Protestant group to another. You have some hypotheses about what's behind that? What is driving it? Is it social change? Is it some other phenomenon that's pushing the change in religious belief or affiliation?
I think among Protestants in particular, so this switching that I mentioned within Protestantism, a lot of it is much more basic and straightforward than that. Maybe you move to a new community and they don't have a Presbyterian church near your neighborhood, so you start going to the Lutheran church. Maybe you marry somebody who's of a different Protestant faith. Some people tell us that this is the case. So a lot of that sort of within Protestantism change is very practical. But at the same time, there are some sort of bigger changes. Maybe you go from a theologically very liberal church to a theologically very conservative church. And to that degree, there's some change in both directions. A lot of the growth within conservative Protestantism comes from within, higher fertility rates and higher retention rates and things like that. But to the degree that there's switching, it kind of goes in multiple directions.
Is there a correlation between a rise in education and a rise in nuns?
That is a good question. I'm not sure offhand what the figures are as far as the share of the population that has a college education, for example, and how that trend line might track along with the unaffiliated. I would have to sort of take a look at those numbers a little bit more closely. But again, I'll just mention that this growth has been among multiple levels of education.
Somebody is curious to know whether there are significant unaffiliated percentages among educators in higher education. Those people losing their faith teaching.
I think I've heard this narrative before that, you know, the godless are making your children more godless or something.
Yeah.
But we don't have in our data like a sample specifically of educators to look at their religious affiliation. So we'll have to leave that to another study.
I don't know whether to thank you or not for not knowing, but it's okay. Did many atheists or agnostic people tend to grow up in denominations or religions that tend to be extreme in views on social issues?
That's an interesting question. I haven't looked specifically at that subset of the unaffiliated and sort of where they're coming from specifically, but my sense is that they're coming from multiple directions. So at least some are coming from, you know, maybe more strict religious backgrounds. And when we ask them various questions about why they left their religion and if certain things were important, there are some people who are reacting to sort of a strict or conservative worldview. But then, like I mentioned, there are others who just simply sort of drifted away or started questioning, stopped believing, started thinking, you know, that maybe they didn't believe some of the teachings. So there's a lot of variation within this group.
Someone wants to know if your slides are available someplace.
These are not available on the website, but almost all of the information comes from our report titled Nuns on the Rise, which is available on the website on pewresearch.org. And it's a 2012 study. You can download the PDF from there.
Okay. Do you think that one influencing factor in the rise of the nuns is due to society's push for acceptance of all things as being right or okay? There's no absolute truth. There's respect for everybody's belief, whatever it might be.
It could be sort of part of an overarching, you know, increasing push for acceptance or inclusion or tolerance, things like that. And it seems that, at least to some degree, that social desirability factor that I was talking about, the sort of pressure to say you're part of a religion, that has been declining to some degree. So it could be that those things are associated. It's hard to get at with a survey.
Good question here. How do these trends in the United States compare with other Western nations like the UK?
Well, I think with the UK, you know, you saw the disaffiliation a long time ago, and so I mentioned secularization in this talk, and you know, some early American sociologists thought that secularization was coming any minute for us because it had happened in these other nations, but the US continues to be very religious in comparison, even with these recent fairly large changes. So for example, when you look at the share of people who say religion is very important in their lives, it's, you know, at least half of Americans say that, and it's far less in many of these other countries, less than a quarter in many of these places.
Does the phrase spiritual but not religious fit and describe the data?
I think I actually have a slide on that I didn't show. Let me show you. We asked people in a 2012 study if they consider themselves a religious person, if they consider themselves a spiritual person, so then we can kind of cut it and see those that say religious, those that say spiritual, those that say both or one or the other. Let me see if I can find that. Yeah, it's right here. So among the general public overall, 65% of themselves, or 65% think of themselves as a religious person, 18% say they're spiritual but not religious, and 15% say they're neither of these things. But the second column there is the unaffiliated, and among them, only 18% say they're religious, 37% say they're spiritual but not religious, and 42% say neither. So there is some segment of this population that considers themselves spiritual but not religious.
Do you think that people are turned away from religion because of the recent religious persecutions around the world?
I think there's probably at least some degree of that. Again, when we ask like an open-ended question about why you left your religion, there are some people who have just a very negative association with religion overall. But I don't think that that's the main driver of what we're seeing here.
Would you say that the freedom of not being tied down or being affiliated with a particular religion, does that sense or of freedom attract other people to be nuns? Nuns are not out there proselytizing the way religious denominations and churches are.
Yeah, most of them. There might be a few atheists that proselytize also, but that's a really interesting question. I'm not sure. We haven't asked a question that sort of gets at that as part of the reason, but it might be worth asking.
You mentioned right-wing politics. What about left-wing politics and its impact on the data?
That's a legitimate question. It's not something that sociologists have theorized about, so I can't point to any studies or research that's looked at it particularly, but you certainly see some pushback among religious folks, against some of the more left-leaning liberal ideas, things having to do with same-sex marriage, for example, and the religious freedom debates that are coming up and things like that. I don't know to what degree. I think that'd be more associated with those who are affiliated than pushing people to disaffiliate, but it's not something that has been very closely examined.
A couple specific questions. Is there anything in your research that connects or disconnects the decline in belief in the existence of God? The decline, or yes, try it again. Disconnects or connects the decline in belief in the existence of God to the events of 9/11?
I actually, that's interesting that you bring that up, because I just was looking at a different measure the other day in response to someone's question. I haven't looked at whether belief in God is associated with that, but I would expect it would have the opposite effect. And the reason I say that is we ask a question fairly regularly about whether people think that religion's influence is increasing in society or decreasing in society or about the same. And when we asked that question right after 9/11, we saw a huge jump in the percentage of people saying they thought religion's influence was increasing. And you sort of saw a religious resurgence at that time. So I haven't looked specifically at the belief in God question, but I have a sense that for many it was the opposite effect.
Do you have any sense or statistic regarding the sexual orientation of people surveyed and the impact thereof?
That's something we've just recently started to ask about in surveys. And so it's not something that we've analyzed yet, but it's a very small percentage of the public who self-identifies in the LGBT categories. We did do a survey, I think it was either last year or the year before, specifically of people who identify as LGBT, and sort of ask them some questions about, to what degree they feel welcome in their churches and things like that. And there are a lot of folks who, don't feel welcome in various kinds of churches across the board. And so it would be interesting to be able to dig deeper into that, but that's a question that we've only started to ask more recently. So I wouldn't be able to look at these long-term trends by sexual orientation.
Okay, so if we want to know when to get that data, that's related to the next question. Tell us a bit more about the center. How many employees? How long does it take to survey 35,000 people? And how are you funded?
Yeah, so I'll start with the last one. We're primarily funded by the Pew Charitable Trusts. So we were established by the Pew Charitable Trusts as an independent research organization. And most of our funding comes from their endowment money. But we also have some grants from other sources, depending on the topics of the research that we're doing. But in order to maintain our non-advocacy and nonpartisan stance, we're very selective about who we partner with to receive grant money for projects like that. So that's that question. I think we have around 130 employees. It might be a little bit more now. That's across the whole center, so that's including researchers and our communications staff and our administration staff and the people who do all the great things on the website that I'm completely incapable of creating. And it includes, research staff that focuses on 7 or 8 big topic areas. So just those who focus mainly on religion and public life, there are around 30, 35 of us. And it takes a couple of months at least to interview 35,000 people. So that I mentioned the 2007 religious landscape study. That was one big study where we intended to survey, that many people, ask them all the same exact questions. But some of our other figures here, so that big pie chart that I showed you from 2012, that's aggregated, monthly surveys where we asked religion, but the rest of the questions weren't necessarily the same. So that's 20-some thousand people that we sort of get in smaller surveys, 1,000 to 2,000 people at a time. So the size of a survey varies quite a bit.
Historically, there's been a strong sense of community, and that sense was important to blacks and to Latinos. Do you see that this has declined over time or stayed about the same?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure if we have. Probably we do, but it's not coming to mind, a question sort of specifically about, we asked this one about, is it important that you have a community with shared values? That was a general public survey, so our samples of, say, Black Protestants and Latino Catholics are very, very small. But we haven't seen until pretty recently this this disaffiliation trend as much among blacks and Latinos as among whites, for example. But we are starting to see this decrease in affiliation among all of these groups. So the degree to which that is, community being less important, that's sort of an extra question that we'd have to look at. But there has been sort of a lag in the disaffiliation, I think, among these groups.
Could you expand a bit on the difference between category of agnostics and the nones? Both affirm beliefs in a deity of sorts, but don't define their belief systems in a comprehensive sense.
Well, this is a complicated question. So when I'm talking about the nones, I'm talking about people who tell us they're atheists or agnostic or nothing in particular. So the way that we define atheists and agnostics for our reporting purposes is just self-identification. You told me you're an agnostic, so that's what I'm going to call you, as an agnostic. You told me you're an atheist, so we're going to call you an atheist. But you might notice that when you ask people about their belief in God, you get some atheists telling you that they believe in God. So there's some confusion, I think, among some people what these terms mean. And agnostics generally, we would define as people who don't know one way or another if there's God, but you see among this group some people also expressing a belief in God. So really the difference between these groups as we report them is just that they have called themselves one of these terms or another.
And how do you explain that among the nones, something like, if I remember correctly, 19% said religious life and spiritual life was important to them?
Well, there are some people who fall into this nones category who still go to church sometimes, who still pray daily. They might consider themselves to have a personal relationship with God, but they don't want to claim a connection to any particular religious organization. So, for some people it's sort of a rejection of institutionalized religion, but they still feel like they have some sort of spiritual or religious life.
Is there a sense that moral authority is shifting from institutions, churches and the like, to individuals?
I think you could probably speculate that way. I'm not sure that our data can speak directly to that, but I think if you look at some of these trends, it's at least a question that's worth pursuing more, but I don't have a direct answer to that.
Go get a grant.
Yes.
Do you think the removal of prayer and religion from schools is a factor for the nones?
I don't know. I don't know to what degree prayer was in all schools at one point, so you sort of have to start there and see if you could document the change versus, you know, just the change in discourse. And that's something that I don't have data on, so I can't answer that one either.
What are the trends for Judaism? Are they the same as what you've been talking about?
Well, Jews are a really interesting group to study from a religious perspective because in the pie chart I showed you at the beginning, for example, where you see that about 2% of the US population is Jewish, that's people who tell us in response to the question about religion. What's your religion, if any? Are you Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, Buddhist, Hindu? We give them several options. That's the share who tell us that they're Jewish by religion, and that share has been very stable over time. But we did a bigger survey of US Jews in 2012, and we tried to ask more expansive questions than just religion, because there are many Jews in the US who consider themselves atheists or who consider themselves Jews by ethnicity or by culture or by background, by ancestry, but don't consider themselves Jews by religion. So it's sort of a group that's, you know, a combination of religion and ethnicity and ancestry. And if you're just asking about religion, it's a very stable group. But if you ask more broadly, you see that it's more diverse in terms of religious beliefs.
That's helpful, thanks. What information exists about people who leave or join non-Christian religions?
Well, there's not a ton, just because those groups are very small still in the US. So non-Christian religions are growing, especially with immigration from different parts of the world, but they're still small enough that the share of people who have switched from, say, Protestantism to Islam or something along those lines is so small that we can't pull them out separately and analyze them. We'd have too small of a sample to be able to say much about that group.
Okay.
So you have to do surveys of 35 million or something instead of 35,000.
How many or what percentage of industrial countries in the world are more religious than the United States?
I don't know for sure, but I don't know of any offhand. So that's a short non-answer.
Is the decline in religious beliefs correlated with a greater understanding of the universe and its laws?
That is a very good question. I don't know. I mean, I suppose one way you could get at it is to look at the correlation between affiliation and education, and but even that, you don't know specifically what type of education people are getting, what field it's in. You know, are there astrophysicists that are less affiliated now? Maybe, but we don't have the sort of granular measurement of education in our surveys.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to ask you one more question, but I want to thank you for coming. So, and I hope the plane ride back isn't too bumpy. So
Thanks.
We're glad to have you here.
Thanks.
Be a little less analytical, if you will, and a little more willing to gamble. Where do you think all this is going? Where are the trend lines going to be 5 or 10 years down the line with regard to affiliation and changes in practice and belief, and what difference might it make?
Well, I think in the US in particular, in the short term, I would expect to see this same trend line continue, to see the unaffiliated continue to grow. Our demography team actually just completed a very huge project looking at religion around the world and trying to project those trends and where they'll end up based on things like fertility rate and immigration and switching and all those kinds of things. And that data actually suggests that globally, the unaffiliated will shrink over time because they tend to have fewer kids. It tends to be, you know, a group that's just not going to grow on its own. And instead, Christianity and Islam will continue to grow. As far as what the consequences are, that's hard to speculate about. I think, you know, we know some things about the unaffiliated and who they are and what they look like. I mentioned, for example, that they're much more democratic leaning, they're more liberal. I think they're also less likely to vote, though. So maybe as this group grows, they're sort of more liberal leaning, but they're less engaged in many ways. And so that could have political implications in either direction, depending on how many are engaged. But we're also seeing growth among this group across the board demographically, so it might become less homogeneously liberal leaning. So there's sort of a lot of factors to speculate about, so I can tell you if this, then that, and if this, then that, but that's sort of my wiggly answer to your question.
Okay, like a good sociologist, on the one hand, on the other hand. Thank you very much. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.